In 2024, Bandai Namco Filmworks announced that a new Ghost in the Shell anime was in production and slated to be released in 2026. And in January, we got a look at visuals for the new project, which promises to be a faithful adaptation of the original 1989 manga penned by Masamune Shirow. Now, Ghost in the Shell lives in a very funny place in pop culture. It's one of the most adapted mangas in the world, having several animated movies based off of it, a few shows, and the live-action movie with Scarlett Johansson. But none of them are one-to-one with the original manga. Not even close. They all take elements from the comic and rearrange them in order to tell a story that feels true to the original while doing their own thing. As such, I found online that there's a lot of talk about almost every aspect of the franchise, but very little about the original. Why is that? The 1995 movie adaptation by director Mamoru Oshii is a good example of what I mean. He took the most memorable story from the first volume and adapted it while taking pieces from other stories in the manga in order to make one cohesive work. The climax of the movie is a rework of 4 different parts of the manga, and only 2 of them have anything to do with the puppeteer plot. What is weirder is that the 2022 TV adaptation deviates from the source material even more, so much so that standalone complex is mostly its own thing, taking the stories in the original and loosely adapting them. And if you try to look up online facts about the Ghost in the Shell alternative history, you will mostly find timelines and events from this version of the story. And I find that very strange, that the official wiki of the franchise is mostly a fact repository for standalone. The climatic scene that I was talking about earlier featured a spider tank, and the pilot of that tank, Toru Soma, is only a footnote in the wiki. And in the first volume of the manga, he got closer than anyone to killing the protagonist, and had a rich personal history with them, which I can't say for a lot of other antagonists in the series. While the manga is split into 3 volumes, because of how Masamune wrote them, I'm not so sure that all 3 will be adapted. The second volume is about the supporting cast of the first, and the third comes back to the original lead 4.5 years after the events of the first book, and it does mostly its own thing. In the first volume, the story is about Motoko Kusanagi, as she helps set up and lead a new anti-cyber-terrorism unit, Public Security Section 9, with Chief Daisuke Aramaki serving as the government head, the one that handles all the political minutiae. But the field commander is always Motoko, a hyper-competent military officer that also excels in hacking and cybersecurity, as well as being one of the few full-bodied cyborgs, making her not only uniquely qualified for the job, but also she has skin in the game. Because it's written as an anthology, with every chapter being a self-contained story, I can see the new adaptation being a short 6 to 8 episode affair. The only problem with the whole thing are the side notes that pepper Masamune's work. Throughout all of the manga, he puts in the corners anecdotes and world-building elements that he otherwise couldn't add into the story in a more diegetic way. And these aren't detective noir-style texts that set the mood or get you in the headspace of the characters. These are hard sci-fi facts and other thoughts the author considered important enough to stop the story for, like the weapon Motoko uses in Chapter 3, the Saburo C-25A, a fictional gun inspired by the Belgian-made FNP-90. Or how in the same chapter, The author wrote, and I quote, "After this, there's a scene where Motoko takes over the driving and Togasa checks his gear and puts it on. But it was too much of a hassle to draw, so I left it out." End quote. And these notes are the ones that were kept as annotations for the pages of the Western release of the manga. At the back of the book, there are 14 extra pages of author's notes. If you decide to pick up the manga, I can say you don't really need to go back and forth to check the notes. The story is understandable as is, for the most part. The part in Masamune's writing that may be a deal breaker for most is the long-winded monologues on the philosophical nature of existence. The worst example of this is the last chapter, where, for about half the pages, the author, through the character of the puppeteer, gives out what may be a philosophical doctoral thesis, for all I know. Up until this point, there were smaller, much more succinct speeches at the end of the chapters, as a way to punctuate the theme and messages of that issue. But the last one overstays its welcome, and even in other adaptations of the manga, the text is reworked to make it more palatable, and even then, people find it a bit too cumbersome. I'm curious how the animators are going to handle the late 80s, early 90s manga style in a more modern anime. Old cell animation matched the cyberpunk aesthetics with its desaturated colors, giving a more gritty look to the whole thing. However, the colored pages of the manga used a lot of watercolors, giving a lighter, softer look, something that digital art is better at. From the limited material we have of the upcoming anime, it looks to be shaping up quite well. We also see that the character designs are taken from the first volume, because in the second and third, Shiro's arc changes drastically. In the sequel series, the way he draws the human figure feels more grounded, more in frame. They have a larger, heavier feel to them, with a greater degree of detail to the characters. And in the third, there's also this soft, transition shading on the characters, that along with the 3D avatars that show up from time to time, I wouldn't be surprised if the art was processed digitally, with some early version of Photoshop. I believe that if the new adaptation stays faithful to the original text, it has a good chance of capturing an audience of both newcomers and older fans, because, in spite of all of its flaws, Ghost in the Shell, the original, stands up very well to this day. There is a reason why this story has stood the test of time and has inspired so many movies like The Matrix. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. The themes of transhumanism and the sci-fi concepts from back then have aged a lot better than you would expect. It's also a very hopeful story for a cyberpunk cop show, where the members of Section 9 fight corruption from within the Japanese government as well as any terrorist. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, and thank you for watching.